Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to cut through the noise and get to the heart of what's shaping our world. Have you ever really stopped to think how decisions made way up in Washington, D.C., or maybe in global trade talks, actually filter down? How they impact, say, your mortgage rate, or even just the prices stuff you buy every week. These big forces, they're always there. Today, we're digging into two areas. They seem separate, but they're actually really connected. First up, the U.S. Federal Reserve. We're looking at the surprising legal balancing act it has to do between independence and, well, potential presidential control. Then we'll jump into the messy world of global trade wars, specifically how recent tariffs are hitting the world economy, and particularly the UK. And we've got some fantastic material to work with today. This deep dive comes courtesy of the professional research team at Expert Trader UK. They've compiled a really impressive stack of sources, constitutional law analysis from George Mason University's C. Boyden Gray Center, economic models from Aston University. Just a treasure trove, really. Okay, let's unpack this. There's a lot here, and I think, honestly, what we find might change how you think about economic power. So let's start with the Federal Reserve. The Fed, it's arguably the most important independent agency in the U.S., right? It's kind of atop the whole global financial system, maybe even the global economy. It's the world's most powerful central bank, controls the paper money supplies, its monetary policy, huge influence. But here's where it gets tricky. The Fed is supposed to be independent, but how independent is it really? What's the core challenge?
Well, yeah, the tension really comes from its structure. It's unique. You've got this incredibly powerful body doing very public things, but it's built with these elements meant to insulate it from politics. Take the Board of Governors. That's the main governing body. 7 members nominated by the president, confirmed by the Senate. They get these long 14-year staggered terms.
14 years. Wow. That sounds pretty independent.
It does, but here's the catch. They can be removed for cause by the president. And the key thing is, for cause isn't actually defined anywhere in this context. So it's a big legal gray area.
Undefined. Okay, and what about the chair? Like Jerome Powell, they get all the headlines.
Right. The chair has massive real-world influence, moves markets, but formally, the position itself has surprisingly few duties spelled out. And here's the kicker, as you said. There's no explicit law protecting the chair from being removed as chair, only as a governor.
Ah, okay. So the protection is tied to the governor role, not the chair role itself.
Exactly. And the vice chair for supervision, who actually has maybe the broadest specific authority granted in the Federal Reserve Act, also doesn't have explicit removal protection for that specific role.
Like layers of complexity.
It is. And then you have the 12 regional Federal Reserve banks. These are often seen legally more like private corporations that the government has an interest in rather than direct government agencies.
Private corporations? Really?
Sort of. Their presidents are appointed by their own directors with board approval, mind you, for 5-year terms. And crucially, these presidents cannot be removed by the U.S. president. And these regional presidents, they rotate onto the FOMC, the Federal Open Market Committee. That's the group actually setting monetary policy like interest rates.
So it's this mix of presidential appointees and these non-presidential appointees making the big decisions.
Precisely. It's designed for insulation.
And this isn't totally new, right? Didn't the U.S. have central banks before the Fed?
Yeah, good point. Before 1913, there was the first bank back in 1791 and the second bank in 1816. They were technically private institutions, private shareholders, though the government chartered them and owned some shares. They did basic monetary policy stuff, influencing money supply, interest rates, and the key thing, their officers generally weren't subject to direct presidential control. This history kind of suggests that traditionally, some banking functions were seen as outside direct executive power.
Okay, so that history matters for today's debates.
Absolutely. It sets the stage for this whole question about the president's removal power, which the Supreme Court has, well, revisited quite a bit. Article 2 of the Constitution gives the president executive power, implying they can remove executive officials. For a long time, a 1935 case, Humphrey's Executor, was the big one. It limited the president's power, saying they couldn't easily fire heads of agencies doing quasi-judicial or quasi-legislative stuff, not purely executive. That protected agency independence.
Right. Humphrey's Executor was the shield for agencies like the Fed for decades.
Right.
But you're saying that's changed.
Significantly. More recent Supreme Court cases, like Sela Law in 2020 and Collins v. Yellen in 2021, have really strengthened the president's hand again. They basically said Congress can't stop the president from firing the head of a single-headed independent agency like the CFPB or FHFA in those cases. The court carved out only narrow exceptions. maybe multi-member expert agencies that don't wield substantial executive power or lower-level officers.
Okay, so single director agencies are clearly under presidential control. But the Fed is multi-member, so how does this apply?
That's the million-dollar question. Here's the potential issue. When the Fed acts like a regulator, bringing enforcement action, issuing fines, writing banking rules, it is using executive power. And if we follow the logic of these recent court cases, well, the argument could be made that because some of its functions are executive, the president's removal power might extend to all its functions, even monetary policy.
Yeah. So the regulatory side could make the monetary policy side vulnerable to political interference.
Potentially. It suggests that the for-cause protection for governors might be interpreted very broadly by a future administration, maybe broadly enough to include just disagreeing with policy.
So you have this history suggesting independence for monetary policy, like the old banks.
Right.
But the Fed today is also a massive regulator. Systemic stability, bank supervision, payments, consumer protection. It does a lot.
It's a full-fledged regulator, as the sources put it.
So what's the takeaway for you listening? Well, it means the stability we often take for granted, the idea of an independent Fed making tough calls without political pressure. It might be on constitutionally shakier ground than we think. And you see this play out. We've seen reports, discussions mentioned in the Expert Trader UK materials about political figures wanting the Fed board to, quote, take control and push rates down. The pressure is real.
It is, although it's important to remember, the board decides by consensus. It's not just the chair. And those regional presidents who aren't government employees, they get votes too.
True, but any vacancy on the board gives a president a chance to nominate someone new, potentially shifting that consensus. It highlights the vulnerability.
Definitely.
Okay, so that's the internal power dynamic. Let's pivot now. From power struggles inside an institution to power plays between nations. Let's talk about trade wars and tariffs. Tariffs, basically taxes on imports. Governments often use them trying to shield domestic industries. Sounds simple, maybe even appealing short term, but the economic models usually warn about retaliation, things spiraling.
Yeah, and history gives us a pretty stark warning here. Unilateral protectionism tends to lead to widespread losses. Cooperation and clear rules. That's what fosters prosperity. Think Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act 1930. U.S. tariffs shot up to like 45% on average. It's widely seen as making the Great Depression much, much worse.
A classic example of things going wrong.
Exactly. And the reaction to that eventually led to things like GDOE, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and later the WTO, the World Trade Organization. These systems promoted reciprocity countries lowering tariffs together and non-discrimination, basically treating trading partners fairly. And it worked. Global tariffs plummeted from around 40% in 1947 to under 4% by 2010. Huge success story.
But that era of smooth sailing seems, well, over. We saw a resurgence with the Trump administration's trade actions starting around 2018.
We did, and that first wave, 2018-2019, is a really useful recent case study. Those tariffs, 10-25% on steel, aluminum, lots of Chinese goods. The cost was almost entirely passed through to U.S. import prices, meaning U.S. consumers and businesses paid for it.
So the idea that the exporting country pays the tariff, that didn't happen.
Largely no. The cost hit U.S. importers and consumers. Estimates were around $3.2 billion per month in extra costs, including about $1.4 billion in pure deadweight loss, just economic value vanishing.
Ouch. And the overall impact.
U.S. imports fell about 12%. Exports dropped 11%. Total losses for U.S. consumers and firms hit something like $51 billion.
And globally.
The impact was massive. Those tariffs set off a chain reaction, retaliation. Global welfare was estimated to have been slashed by up to $1.4 trillion. Prices went up everywhere. Supply chains got messed up.
And what about countries not directly involved, the bystanders?
It was mixed. Some, like Vietnam, actually benefited a bit from what's called trade diversion. They stepped in to supply things the U.S. wasn't buying from China or vice versa. But others, especially countries closely tied to China's economy, think Indonesia, Malaysia, Brazil, they saw slowdowns, less demand from China, disrupted supply chains. It shows how interconnected everything is.
Looking forward, there are frameworks being discussed, like this Mirren 2024 paper mentioned by Expert Trader UK for potential future tariffs in 2025. What's the thinking there?
Well, some of the strategic goals mentioned are pretty ambitious. Things like tackling the perceived overvaluation of the dollar, dealing with the Triffin dilemma, that classic problem where the world's reserve currency country has conflicting domestic and international needs. The framework suggests things like graduated tariffs, varying them based on trade fairness or currency practices, using international coordination but also unilateral action on currency, and coupling it all with domestic low taxes and deregulation.
Okay, so a complex strategy. Now, how does the UK fit into all this turbulence,
Yeah.
especially post-Brexit?
Right. The UK is in a really interesting and maybe precarious position. As a major trading nation outside the EU bloc now, the sources describe it as facing a dual-edged situation.
Dual-edged. How so?
Well, in some scenarios, analyze where the U.S. imposes tariffs, but maybe the U.K. doesn't retaliate strongly, or others do. The U.K. could actually gain export share to the U.S. because trade gets diverted away from retaliating countries like Canada, Mexico, or China. The model showed potential U.K. export gains to the U.S. of nearly 10%, even up to 17.5% in one scenario.
Okay, so some potential upside from trade diversion. But what's the other edge of the sword?
The downside is significant. While exports to the U.S. might rise, U.K. imports from the U.S. could fall quite a bit, maybe 5% to 10%. That exposes vulnerabilities. Think about critical U.K. industries relying on U.S. parts, aerospace, high-tech components. Supply chain disruption is a real risk.
Right. And what about trade with China?
U.K. exports to China could also decline in these scenarios, maybe 4 or 5%.
In the worst case scenario,
Yeah.
full global retaliation, everyone throwing up tariffs.
Yeah, that's where it gets really bad for the UK, according to the models from Aston University that Expert Trader UK highlighted. In that scenario, UK-US bilateral trade just collapses. UK exports to the US plummet by over 40%. Imports from the US fall by two-thirds, about 66%. At that point, the whole global economy shrinks so much that any earlier gains from trade rerouting are just wiped out. It shows the UK's exposure as an open economy.
So given this tricky position, what should the UK be doing? What do the experts recommend?
The research points towards a pragmatic, multi-pronged approach. First, really focus on supply chain resilience. That means diversifying where you get things from, maybe looking more towards Japan, South Korea, and also boosting domestic production capacity where feasible, like in automotive parts or electronics. Reduce that reliance on imports that might get hit by tariffs.
Makes sense. Diversify risk.
What else?
Second, trade diversification more broadly. Actively push trade towards areas less caught up in the immediate conflict, like Southeast Asia, ASEAN, or India. Leverage new trade deals like the CPTPP agreement.
Okay, find new markets, strengthen supply chains.
Third, push for policy stability and agility. That means being a voice for reforming the WTO, trying to strengthen the rules against unilateral tariff hikes. Also, leverage the UK's strengths. Focus on competitiveness in high-value sectors, pharma, finance, tech. Attract investment. Use London's financial clout. Promote green trade initiatives.
And how should it handle the big players, the US and the EU? That requires a careful balancing act. Engage with the US on trade talks, yes, but also reassure the EU. Maybe through symbolic gestures, seeking alignment on WTO reform. Avoid alienating either key partner. It's about balanced engagement.
So wrapping this section up, what does this mean for you listening? It really shows that these big trade disputes, even if they seem far away, have real consequences. They affect the cost of goods, jobs, the health of key industries. It highlights just how vital it is for countries to balance protecting their own interests with keeping the global system stable.
Absolutely. And if you pull back and look at both topics we've discussed, the Fed's independence and these trade wars, there's a really interesting underlying theme, isn't there?
Your case.
It's this tension between concentrated power, whether it's a president potentially influencing a central bank, or one country imposing tariffs unilaterally, and the overall stability of these incredibly complex economic systems. Actions that seem decisive or politically appealing in the short run can just unleash these unpredictable, far-reaching consequences. Unstable interest rates, broken supply chains.
Right. It connects back to that idea. Simple actions, complex ripples.
Exactly. Both studies, the one on the Fed from the C. Boyden Gray Center and the trade analysis from Aston, courtesy of Expert Trader UK, they really show this. What looks like a straightforward move, firing someone, slapping on a tariff, can unravel in ways nobody intended across the whole economy. It makes you ask, in this hyper-connected world, how much control is too much? And where does economic power and, maybe more importantly, accountability actually lie?
That's a great point. And maybe a provocative thought for everyone listening. Think about that delicate balance. If the core institutions managing our economies are constantly subject to political winds, what does that do to the predictability and stability that businesses, and all of us really, rely on day to day globally? Something to mull over. So today we've dug into the constitutional tightrope the Federal Reserve walks and navigated the choppy waters of global trade wars. We've seen the history, the current impacts, the strategic choices countries like the UK are facing. Hopefully this deep dive has given you a useful shortcut to getting up to speed on these really critical matters of the day. And again, a huge thank you to the professional research team at Expert Trader UK. Their work in compiling these sources was invaluable for this discussion. Really top-notch research.
Absolutely. Great resources.
If you found this deep dive valuable, we'd really appreciate it if you'd like this deep dive and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you these kinds of in-depth, curated insights into the things that matter. Thanks for tuning in.